Today we are going to talk about these topics. Number 1. Leadership skills, delegating responsibility. Number 2. Only a passing glance. Number 3. I wish it could have been otherwise. Number 1. Support strategic objectives by identifying roles and responsibilities necessary to support strategic objectives. Defining roles, responsibilities, and degrees of authority needed by individuals and teams. Designing policies and procedures for the management of delegated activities. The purpose of this is to review the distribution of roles and responsibilities at the senior level. The aim of the review is to ensure that the distribution is balanced and appropriate. This is also an opportunity to make certain that the senior, executive level management structure is appropriate for the strategic direction being taken. If mismatches are discovered at this point, then the leader have an opportunity to adjust the organizational structure, at this level, to better match the demands of the strategies. Make decisions on activity to delegate, by deciding which areas of work, routine activity, standalone projects, absence cover, key operational decisions, emergency or business disaster events, and strategic level decisions, should have responsibility or authority delegated to specific managers. This is an essential stage, but a difficult one. It involves forecasting and scenario planning, in order to determine which activities, and in which circumstances, should responsibility and authority be given. It requires the delegating leader to analyze thoroughly the planned activity and potential events, in order to identify where delegation should take place, and to whom it should be given to. Selecting managers and specialists to delegate to, by identifying the current roles, responsibilities and authority of those individuals and teams. Evaluating the skills, abilities, and development potential of existing individuals and teams. Assessing the degree of responsibility and authority that can be given to individuals and teams. Identifying coaching and/or training needs to prepare individuals and teams for delegation. Carefully profiling the existing senior management individuals is critical, because delegation will not be effective if it is given to an individual who is not capable of using the delegated powers effectively. Where gaps in capability are identified, training or coaching should be provided to fill that gap. If the corrective action needs to be long-term, then the delegation should be delayed until that process is complete. Agree responsibilities, levels of authority, and objectives, by identifying delegated responsibilities and levels of authority for each individual manager, specialist, and team. Discussing these with the individual managers and specialists. Agreeing the degree of delegation. Agreeing the objectives delegated to the individual. One of the most critical stages, this is where the details of the delegated responsibility and authority are explained, discussed and agreed. It is at this point that the leader should aim to gain commitment to the delegated responsibilities and authority, to targets and deadlines, both qualitative and quantitative. Clarifying the boundaries, by defining the limits, the boundaries, of the delegated powers. Discussing and agreeing these boundaries. Agreeing action that should be taken when the boundaries are reached. This must be treated as a separate stage in the process, and applies to both the leader and the manager being given delegated powers. The leader must understand and accept that delegation does not mean abandoning responsibility. The ultimate responsibility lies with the leader, the one delegating to others. Delegated powers must be managed and supported by the leader. The individual being given delegated powers must be clear about the limits of those powers, and understand that when that boundary, that limit, is reached, they should refer back to the one who delegated to them. Remove or reduce barriers to effective delegation, by identifying organizational policies, procedures, structures, practices, or cultural aspects, which work against effective delegation. Discuss ways in which barriers could be weakened or removed. Implement changes or adjustments to reduce or eliminate identified barriers. Most organizations have visible and hidden barriers that inhibit and hinder effective management. The role of the leader is to introduce direction, strategies, structures, policies, procedures, and influences into the organization, so that managers and specialists can operate in a culture which encourages creativity, innovation, high-quality performance, and success. In parallel with this, the leader must also encourage managers and specialists to take local responsibility for activities and decision-making. To do this, barriers and constraints must be reduced to a minimum, leaving an appropriate level of controls in place. Provide support for delegated activity by discussing and agreeing the level and nature of support needed. Adopting a leadership style that provides appropriate availability, support and guidance to those with delegated responsibilities, but also allowing them the freedom to carry out the delegated powers without unnecessary interference. Reviewing levels of personal support and adjusting that support appropriately. Consistently behaving in a manner that inspires and motivates those who have been delegated to. There are two most common reasons for delegation to fail. One is that the analytical and decision-making process was not thorough enough, leading to the degree of delegation being inappropriate. However, the other most common reason for failure is that the leader delegates and then does not provide appropriate support to the manager being delegated to. Once the leader has delegated, they must then provide an appropriate level of personal support, encouragement, and resources to the individual. This support should include publicizing the delegated powers to relevant individuals and teams internally, informing other stakeholders such as suppliers, customers, clients, of the delegated powers, coaching, mentoring, providing training, as appropriate. Reward performance by openly praising consistently high-quality operational performance and exceptional event performance. Building performance on delegated powers into the organization's performance appraisal system. An important part of the process, because delegated powers are, by default, in the highest group of demands made on the individual, and when performed well, are deserving of recognition and praise. Rewards do not have to be substantial, nor monetary in nature. Recognition and praise will be appreciated by the receiving individual and by their teams and other observers. The leader who delegated the powers must ensure that, when appropriate, high levels of performance in delegated areas are achieved. Monitor, review, and adjust by implementing regular reviews of the delegation process and of individual instances. Reviewing the appropriateness of current and planned delegation against the most current strategic objectives. Taking corrective action where necessary. The leader delegating powers to others should implement a monitoring and review process that requires them to review the whole process and individual performance. Individual performance should be monitored continuously, with formal review points at least quarterly. The overall process should be reviewed at least every 6 months, at which point the success of the process should be evaluated against the original objectives and then adjusted to take into account changes in operational activity and in strategic direction. In summary, leaders must delegate, but must delegate effectively. The most successful leaders treat delegation as an essential strand of their leadership approach. Senior management structures, processes, and objectives are reviewed to ensure suitability for delegation to take place. Areas of work, activities, routine and event-specific decisions are analyzed, evaluated, and where appropriate the decision is made to delegate responsibility and authority. Delegated powers are explained, discussed, and agreed, and measurable objectives set. The leader then builds on this by adopting a consultative, supporting, coaching role, as appropriate for each of the individuals delegated to. Individual performance on applying delegated powers is monitored and adjusted as necessary. Finally, the performance of the delegation process itself is monitored and reviewed by the leader and the senior management team, to ensure that it remains compatible with the strategic direction being taken by the organization. Number 2. What is faith? Faith is believing in something. Confident belief in the truth, value, or trustworthiness of a person, concept or idea. It is the mental acceptance of the truth or actuality of something. In its positive aspect, it is a belief in the favorable outcome of anything undertaken. There are two kinds of faith. The first is a faith that is predicated on truth, and can be proven by experiment. The experiment that proves this truth is one that produces the same result every time. As an example, one might say 2 + 2 makes 5, but that does not make it true. In fact, upon hearing this, one might become convinced and even convince others that this is correct, and still this would not make it true. The only possible way to get the correct answer to a mathematical problem is to conform to the established laws of mathematics, which are based upon truth. Therefore, in applying this law, you get the correct answer, 2 + 2 = 4, at any time, at any place, and under any conditions. Truth. The second is based upon ignorance, conjecture or supposition. This is a faith that has not been fully determined by tested experiment. No matter the fervor in its tenets, this professed faith is still in a state of doubt and uncertainty until empirical experiment can prove that it is either true, or reveal that it is false. As an example, for 5,000 years people believed implicitly that the world was flat. They had the utmost faith in their belief. Columbus came along, and, by experiment, proved that the world was round. Their earlier faith was based on ignorance, and an experiment proved that it was false. People had an untrue faith, exacerbated by the church, that the sun revolved around the earth, until Copernicus discovered the truth. Over time, many other beliefs were held to be true as well, until they were proven to be false, and the debunking of conjecture and supposition continues to this day. Flawed and outmoded thought consensus, perpetuated by our fear and indolence, a trait of our human nature, causes us to steadfastly hold on to the security blanket of established orthodoxy. We let go only grudgingly when confronted with irrefutable scientific proof. Faith may be bolstered by knowledge, but that knowledge too may be true or false. After all, knowledge is the state of being aware of something, or the possession of information. It is very easy to be aware of something and true, or to possess information that may prove to be false. Therefore, the old saying that knowledge is power should be revised. Knowledge is power provided that it is based upon a truth, otherwise it may be a tremendous burden, a serious impediment, a decided hindrance, and a very present handicap to mental or spiritual development and progress. And burdened is where we are today, handicapped by our misguided faith in the efficacy of our respective economies, the lack of credibility in our leaders, and the false idols of progress at whatever cost. And success no matter what it takes. We are entering a period in our collective consciousness where the next great paradigm shift in perceptions will leave most of us still thinking the world is flat single quote and that we can just continue to keep on keeping on. Many unwary will be left devastated. And this is where the laws of the universe come into play. God as all-pervasive energy is invisible and all of his laws are invisible. No one can see life, spirit, thought, electricity, atomic energy, or any form of power. All we see is the manifestation of those powers. Mankind, despite his arrogance, does not create power. He merely discovers it and appropriates it to his own use, sometimes wisely, sometimes not. He has harnessed electrical power, mathematical power, chemical power, atomic power, and many other forms of power. But the greatest of all power is treated with only a passing glance, and that is spiritual power. Many of today's thinkers, scientists and physicists are beginning to express a view that the greatest discoveries going forward will be along spiritual lines. Here is a force which history now clearly teaches has been the greatest power in the development of mankind. Yet, so far, we have merely been playing with it and have never seriously studied it as we have the physical forces. Now that we have an understandable conception of truth and its application to other forms of energy, the time has come, in survival and in evolutionary terms, to devote more time to discovering the underlying truth of spiritual power. No doubt someone will try to find a way to pervert it for personal gain or power, but this truth, by its very nature, may not be so amenable to selfish human intervention. Appropriate use of this consciousness-raising power would be a great asset for improving and enhancing every aspect of true personal growth as well as sorely needed synergistic social cohesion. Number 3. This was written for an academic journal about people with disabilities and what that means concerning their parent-child relationships. As far back as I can remember, I have been hearing voices. It started when I was just 3 months old. I remember lying on my back in a cold sweat, undergoing nicotine withdrawal, my smoking mother having switched from breastfeeding to bottled formula. Gasping for breath, I heard my father yelling at my sister in the next room. She was wetting the bed every night, and my father was extremely upset. I couldn't understand at all, and was preparing to scream aloud. Suddenly a voice went off in my head, saying if you scream, something very bad will happen to you. Since I was only a baby, it wasn't in words, but I could hear the voice. I screamed anyway, and my mother came in, swooping me out of the crib into her loving arms. I heard my father's yelling increase, and the sounds of my sister being spanked. It was so awful I can recall it even now, though I know that seems utterly impossible. I grew up clumsy, antisocial, unable to communicate well. And the voices continued. I was watching TV once, the Green Hornet show, and I felt something spit very hard between my legs, going straight up my private parts. It was horrible. But I never told my parents about any of these things, keeping it all quietly to myself as the other kids taunted me, making fun of how weird and unusual I was, unable to keep up with them except in my schoolwork. There, I excelled. But for many years I spoke to no one, crying to myself even in the classroom, my body twisting up into awkward shapes uncontrollably. My mother noticed this, but we never saw a doctor about it. Instead, she sought out psychological counseling for me when I entered my teens. This did me no real good. One day, a nice lady coach who had seen me jogging around the high school track asked me to join the girls' track team. I did, and this began a partial recovery from my disabilities and social awkwardness. I made friends, and even came in second in one of our races. By the time I entered college I was pretty much normal, though often subject to strange feelings and occurrences, and occasional voices in my head. But still disturbed and given to crying fits, I dropped out of college, taking off hitchhiking to blindly find my own haphazard way of living. I ended up in Washington State, where I found work as an attendant for the disabled. I met John Tyler, a most amazing man with polio who taught me that disability is not the end of your life, but the beginning, and I made friends with other disabled people. For the first time in my life, I was happy. I blossomed with joy, no longer alone and afraid. I even married the most wonderful man in the world, Ron Schwartz, the son of Austrian Jews who had fled Hitler's Holocaust. He had severe multiple sclerosis and used an electric wheelchair. We could not consummate our marriage, but we were deeply in love just the same. We all lived happily at Center Park, the first major apartment building in the country built specifically for people in wheelchairs and for all kinds of disabled people to abide within its beautiful walls independently. I met every sort of disabled person imaginable, including the deaf-blind, learning all about the various disabilities. But my sweet husband Ron finally died of cancer in February of 1985. 2 short months after my dearest friend John Tyler, my mentor and savior, unhappily succumbed to pneumonia. Working just a few more years for the disabled, I stressed out, unable to work anymore, and in the middle of this, 1986, I had an incident where I tried to hurt myself by falling off a window ledge, ending up hospitalized and on several mental health medications. Previously in 1982 I had been diagnosed as depressed, but had not stayed on medications. Now I was forced to do so, until I finally had myself taken off them again. I went on struggling for years until I met Remigio, my present husband, in a certified nursing class in 1990. I went back to work for a disabled lady, Carrie, again at Center Park. Remigio and I lived with her there until she gave up her battle to live independently and moved to a nursing home, where she died. I and Remigio, constantly arguing due to my mental disability, married and moved into our own apartment. As he couldn't take the constant quarreling, he took me to a psychiatrist friend of his, and once again I was put on strong medications. These hurt me physically, and in 1997 I finally came down with a severe physical disability, chronic dyskinesia of my left arm and head. We are presently treating this by reducing my psychiatric medications and using natural therapeutics. But I still constantly turn to the left, having to struggle to right myself at all times. My left arm sticks straight out, and it's very difficult to bend it, or even type. Yet I had already set myself up years ago in business as a freelance writer, copy editor, copywriter, ghostwriter and website designer under the name Rainbow Writing, Inc. I have my own website, several of them in fact, and am listed within several internet writing agencies. I work 10 to 12 hours a day, almost 7 days a week, getting there by taking frequent breaks. I am just starting to make some money at this, and was recently hired as a full-time ghostwriter by the Floating Gallery of New York City. It's a daily struggle, and my left arm feels like it's going to break off my body at the end of my challenging day. But it keeps me busy, and I truly love my work. Many people have said I am blessed with extraordinary skill and talent, and I try to go a little further and learn a little more each day. Remigio, a former psychiatric aide, certified nurse aide, and doctor of osteopathy, is a godsend. I love him as much as I loved Ron, in spite of my mental problems, which are starting to finally alleviate under Remigio's constant care and loving support. And in 1994, We were blessed during Christmas, the same season that John Tyler died, with a beautiful little daughter, our sweet and loving Angela. Due to my disability, she suffered some psychological trauma, such as during the times I attempted suicide, but although partly severely disabled herself from this, she is healing and pulling through, excelling academically and socially in ways I never was able to learn. She is a dream come true. If I could have written something for my parents, or told them something when I was growing up, I would have told them to not fear my special challenges. I would have asked them to read about people with disabilities, which my mother did a little, reading about an antisocial little boy when she sent me to counseling. I did not even know about disabilities when I was growing up, so I would have asked them to have taken a greater role in my upbringing, as they were often rather aloof and distant. They didn't seem to realize that my problems were not all my own fault, but the fault of fate and my unknown, undiagnosed, untreated mental, social and physical problems. I would tell the parents of children with similar disabilities to mine to pay more attention to their children, never blaming them for their problems, listening to them carefully and never comparing them to normal children, which shames them and only makes matters worse. I would tell them to read books about children with disabilities, and to enter any organizations for such children, exposing their own child to other, similarly burdened children so they would have a peer group, which I did not have until adulthood. I believe they would feel more accepted and normal that way, and a lot happier than I ever was. It would be a much more fun, healthy, and productive life for them to be surrounded with other disabled children, and to develop a healthier, more normal attitude about themselves and their disabilities. Above all, it would help to stress their abilities and cultivate their happiness, both within their families and in society at large, as they learn and grow,